Oh, I have to connect. See, got it. Okay.
Okay. Hi, Linda.
Hi, Tammy. How are you?
I'm great. So nice to see you. Thank you so much
Likewise.
for hopping on at the last moment
No
to be
worries.
my guest on Storytime for Writers. I wanted to squeeze this in this week since it's Friday afternoon, and I let the last week get away from me, having a bunch of stuff going on, and I just thought, no, I'm not going to let the weekend without getting
Good.
our Storytime in. So thanks for being available.
Yep.
So yeah, I just wanted to we've talked about this sort of stuff a lot, right? And you to me are like the expert when it comes from not just writing a memoir but compiling a family history. I mean, for those of you who
Thank
don't
you.
know, check out Linda's book Redlined. It's Thank you, hold that up. A memoir of race, change, and fractured community in 1960s Chicago. And I'll let you describe a little bit about how this book came about, but let's just say that Linda's family notes and history and records are now at the Newberry Library. So that gives you an idea of the scope of this story. And it just really encompasses everything. So Linda's done a great job of taking her own personal family story and using that as a jumping off point to bring in all these other issues and this really incredible kind of microscopic look at what was happening with the redlining situation in Chicago in the 60s. So I wanted to talk to Linda because so many people that I work with who are wanting to write memoirs, first of all, are really afraid to delve into family histories, sometimes for good reason. So
Yep.
you've dealt with that.
Yep.
And other times feel overwhelmed by everything that that they want to cover. And on top of that, I think everybody who writes a memoir has this idea of, why does anyone care? Why does anyone care about my family story?
Yeah.
This is very um, sort of navel gazing, so to speak. And so I think what you did was brilliant. You had this story of your family, but you found a way to give it this context in our culture, what was happening in Chicago. And I think that's a great lesson for people who do have a story that they can broaden it, make it about something bigger, and
Yeah.
make it more, kind of appeal to a broader audience. So tell us a little bit about how you got that idea and what was involved in pulling that off.
Well, it's first of all, I would say the first thing I would advise anybody who wants to write about memoir is to read a lot of memoirs and find the really good ones. I mean, I can just name some right off the top of my head. There is The Road from Kurain. The author's name eludes me at the moment, but she was eventually became the first female president of Smith College. Is a beautiful story of a woman, young girl actually starting out in Australia and how she eventually gets out of Australia from a very difficult life. Growing Up by Russell Baker. He has just passed away in the last year or so, but it is one of the finest memoirs that combines both pathos and family stories, as well as his story of growing up. So you can look online and find, I won't go into a list of memoirs, but you can look online and find out like the 100 best memoirs. So number one, do that. And number two, read books about how to write a memoir. There's lots of great books like that out there as well. So then given that as a pass, because you need some kind of a structure, some kind of a framework to let you know how other people have written about their families and about themselves, and yet made it something that is accessible to everybody else, not just, as was just said, navel gazing, but really a look at a family that helps people understand their own lives. It's the human condition. That's what everybody is looking for, I think, in every bit of writing. What can we tell people about the human condition that they can then take away from our story and think about in their own terms? What happened to me was after my mom died in 1994, we were clearing out her attic and we came across this plethora of family documents, letters, diaries that spanned the entire 20th century. We filled 25 banker's boxes with this stuff. And then we put
Jeez.
it aside. I know, it was amazing. And I didn't have any time to look at it because I was raising little kids. And then a few years later, like really, it took about 8 years till I finally said, I wonder what's in those boxes. Like a little siren song calling to me. So I started out, I had 300 World War II letters. These were letters to and from my uncle, who was a navigator in B-17s in World War II. So that's what I started with because I had never been able to get to know him. And I was immediately sucked into the life of our family in the 1940s because what do people write to a young man in the service but about their families? And about what's going on at home. So I
Right,
really got
sure.
to see, yeah, what my parents' were lives were like, what my grandparents' lives were like, and what his life was like as a young man who's just, a West Side boy and now is expected to help save the world. So, so I started with that, and then I realized there was a book there somewhere, but I didn't know where. And I started to try to write, just started writing. And I thought, I really don't like my writing. I need to become a better writer. So that,
Wow.
I mean, I
No small
recognize that.
task, you know.
So honestly, it was because it wasn't that I had been a writer. I had been a writer for television productions. I wrote and produced documentaries. So I had a sort of a storytelling
Yeah.
background, but I hadn't really tried to write prose. Okay. I, and so then I took writing classes, and that's another thing I'd recommend. Join a writing group, take writing classes, try to write about the things you want to write and get feedback from other people and your professors. But in terms of dealing with the family, I have to say, first of all, that my parents had passed away. I don't think I could have written this particular book with if my parents had been alive because I wanted to be very honest. And that's one of the things I think you learn about in learning about writing memoir. And I kept hearing this again and again. You have got to be honest. People can tell if you're not being honest.
Yeah.
Right, and Tammy's book certainly shows that as well. I mean, you really get her emotional state, and it just reveals so much that I think we as readers can take away from her experience, from Tammy's experience, and say, "Wow, this is how people deal with loss, um, anger, fury, hurt, and move ahead." And that's something we
Yeah.
all need to know how to do. So that's what I took away from one of the many things from Tammy's book.
And it's
So
different to be honest about yourself, right? That's hard enough. But
yeah,
then when also you're including other people in your life, your family members or ex-spouse or, kids or whatever, that's another layer too, right? That scares a lot of people. Like, well, how do I find that balance? How do you how are you honest about your own story? And that's what
mhm,
I always will give that little, hopefully it's a guiding principle is to really, if you're honest about yourself as the writer, you're willing to be really open and authentic, it's almost like if you're willing to be in the spotlight, then everyone else sort of fades and is not in the spotlight. So I think that's a bit of a trick too. And like you said, for your parents wanting to be honest about them, they had passed, so that maybe made it a little bit easier. But you still are putting your whole family history out there. I'm sure siblings and things like that. It still takes a lot of bravery. And was there any time when you thought, oh, I have to change this? I got to pull back, or maybe I'm not going to go through with it?
it wasn't that I thought I wouldn't go through with it. It was trying to figure out with this amazing amount of material, what was the story going to be? Now,
Right.
I always knew that the change of our neighborhood from all white to all black in the 1960s, just seemingly overnight, was going to be part of the story. But then as I read my parents' letters and diaries, I saw how relationships blossom and then can change over time. And that is another part of the story that I had to figure out. How did I want to tell my parents' story, which I did want to tell. I wanted to tell how their lives were and how they were madly in love, kind of fell apart, and then came back together again through sort of not sort of, through a very tragic incident. Um, but I also wanted to, and as I was writing this and presenting it to my writers group, one of the things the writers group members kept saying to me was, there's not enough of you in here. We want to hear more about you, not just about your parents.
The author who hides behind the pen, right? I see that a lot too.
Do you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was, and I sort of didn't want it to be about me, but then I came to realize that, yeah, in a memoir, you have to put yourself out there too. So
Yeah.
slowly it became a memoir also of my coming of age
Yeah.
from a child through a teenage years, through meeting my boyfriend, then became my husband, and the trauma that growing up in the era of the late 60s and the sexual revolution really caused a lot of tension between me and my mom, especially my mom. So that was another thing that was, you know, very difficult for me to write, to read like my mom's diaries where she was so angry with me and hurt and crying,
Wow.
talking in her diary how she's crying all the time and or she's so furious with my dad because she doesn't feel he understands her or and really it's put a lot of responsibility on her to manage a two-flat rooming house. So there were all these things that I wanted to share, but then you had to, make it work. And and all I can say is once I think what happened where I really finally got on track was I finally had to hire an editor and say, I've written all this. I had 135,000 words. It was like a sprawling family history.
Oh,
It
no.
was like two books. And I said,
Right.
what doesn't work in here? Just read it and tell me what I should get rid of.
Yeah.
And that was the start of my kind of getting a grasp of the material.
Yeah.
As she got back to me and said, yeah, all this stuff about your grandparents in Romania, that's like, okay, we don't need that. So in terms of what I had, like I had 40 pages about my uncle in World War II. I reduced that to like one 4 or 5 page chapter. I had about 20 or pages about my grandparents. I reduced that to like a 3 page chapter. So I still put those things in there, but I just got to the essence of what I wanted those things to mean.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you said earlier, I think is so important, that you need a structure. And
Hmm.
I think that's something that a lot of people coming to memoir don't really think in those terms because they think, well, it's a true story or it's my story. So I just tell the truth.
Hmm.
It's like, well, not necessarily. You tell the truth, like big T, right? The essence of the story. You still need it to be a story, right? And a story still
Right.
requires certain elements. You still have to shape it into a story.
Exactly.
Um, and so I think structure, you're right, is so important, especially with memoir. And I love too that you said that you worked with someone who helped you shape it because I mean it's been a while since I've read your book since it was probably 2018 when it first
Yeah,
came
it was
out. But
2018.
I
Yeah.
remember it being just super tight and page turner. And again, you've got two perspectives. You've got you and your family, and then you've got this bigger picture of what's going on in the background. You just kind of seamlessly weave between the two. So that was so interesting. So how much work that is to get to that point. So I
Yeah.
think that, you know, like you said, structure. What else did you say that I thought was really good? Talking about starting with your uncle, I think that's a really good tip too, to find a way in to your
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
What's the interesting part? If you don't want to just do it from beginning to end and do it chronologically at first, or if that feels sort of, you know, like a slog through mud, find what interests you to pull yourself in, right? And that could be the doorway into, again, it speaks to that why am I writing it? If you can
That's right.
connect with your uncle and think, well, I'm interested in this and his experience in the war, and that keeps me motivated,
Yeah.
and that can sort of lead into dealing with the other parts that might not be as fun. So I think those are good tips too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if the why part was something that I kept asking myself, when there's what, or more, even more the why, the what. What is this story about? I kept I was pounding it into my brain, saying, what is this story really about? Because there were a lot of things it was about. But I did, as I'd mentioned, I knew that I wanted to talk about the redlining that had affected our neighborhood and caused this rapid white flight and an immediate change of the neighborhood from all white to all black. So for that, I needed to do more research. And I think if whatever you're writing about, if you're writing memoir, you do usually, maybe not every time, but usually you want to put it in the context of the times, especially if those times affected your memoir. And the times I grew up in definitely affected my memoir because
Right.
the 1960s were very fraught. There was the Vietnam War protests, there was the sexual revolution, there was the women's movement, there was the civil rights movement. I mean, everything kind of boiled up during the 60s. And, there were riots throughout the country after Martin Luther King was killed. Our neighborhood went up in flames. So I needed to, but like to talk about what happened to our neighborhood, I needed to find out what were the systemic racism causes behind it. And that's when I found out more about redlining. And I did a lot of research. I read
Mhm.
a lot of books about redlining. And
And the
then,
great migration, right? That
yes,
was
of
all part of
course,
it. Yeah.
that definitely was part of it. As blacks moved north, both after World War I and after World War II, this influx of, millions of African Americans into northern cities, they were escaping, the Jim Crow South, which had legalized prejudice and racism. But when they came to the North, they didn't necessarily find a welcoming place.
Mhm.
And that's what I wanted to write about as well, and how some very disreputable real estate agents called blockbusters tried to use the fear that whites had of blacks moving into their neighborhoods, mainly because of worried about losing their property values. There's of
Right.
course racism involved, but they felt, oh gosh, I'll lose the value of my property, which was the biggest investment for most people. So that was another thing, is to learn about how people, not very honest people, have been manipulated other people to be able to sell their houses quickly and then at a low price and then sell them at a high price to African Americans. So
Yeah.
that was part of the story too. And there were several books, really good books written about that. So that helped me a
Well,
lot.
and I will say that reading your book was the first that I knew anything about that. I felt very uneducated. So not only was your book an enjoyable read, but it was very educational for me because
That's
I had
great.
no idea that any of that had happened. And
Most
yeah,
people don't. You'd be amazed. It's amazing how many people, even African Americans, do not know what redlining is. I mean, I've found this, like
Mhm.
when I've been at the Printers Row Book Fair, I'll say, do you know what redlining is? And I would say at least 70% of the people, maybe more, have not never heard of
Right,
redlining, especially
right.
young people. And by
Yeah.
young, I mean like 50 and under.
Sounds good. I like that.
Yeah, right.
Well, this is great, Linda. I won't keep you too long, but so before we say goodbye,
Uh-huh.
I'm curious about if you could just, tell me and tell others as well, like what's been your favorite part of the author's journey? Because, I know you have been so hardworking. I mean, I know all the work you put into not only writing it, but afterwards, as we know, like promoting the book
I mean, it's such a hard thing.
and it's a lot. And of course, there's always more to do, right?
Always.
And so we've talked before about the trick is to kind of find the way in again. What do you enjoy? And so I know you've had a lot of speaking engagements, and you've gotten your things at the Newberry, and you just done a lot of different things. What part of it, when you look back, can you say like that's my favorite piece of it? And maybe it was something unexpected.
I would say I really, well, first of all, I can't say the writing itself was fun because it was really work, but
Yeah,
it was satisfying. It was gratifying to finally wrestle all this stuff that I had material into a cohesive story. And I also the other thing I'm very pleased with are the flashbacks that I worked into the book. And that was not easy for me. I mean, I had to study how to do that. I tried it numerous times and finally got it to work, and then that made me very happy. But I'd say one of my favorite things was the people I connected with, doing presentations, um, and explaining to people what my book was about, telling them about redlining. I always would have maps. After we had to go to Zoom because of the pandemic, I created a PowerPoint with a lot of maps in it. And then there's always good questions afterwards, and then meeting the people who want to tell you what they've taken away from your book or what they want to know about more about it. I found the interaction with the people the most gratifying after,
yeah,
obviously after finishing the book. Um,
right.
yeah, and then I have to add, because Tammy's doing this with me, the women that I've met through the whole process, I would say really try to connect with other authors because we are such a supportive group. Many of us here in the Chicago area have published through She Writes Press, and the best part of that has been the other authors that I've met, like Tammy in this neighborhood, learning from them what they did and how they're moving ahead with their books. So I'd say those I guess are the three things: getting the book done, meeting all the people that came, that were interested in learning more about my book and about redlining, and then my wonderful co-authors.
Well,
Co-author
like,
Consensus She Writes Press. Yeah.
yes, no, I feel the same way. I always feel like it's I'll joke that it's sort of a herd of unicorns, like I feel like it's just a nice group of, yeah, people who've been down that same path, and it is a very unique path,
Yeah.
so well, thanks for sharing with us a little bit about your journey, and
Thank you.
anyone who hasn't checked out the book, especially if you love Chicago history and a good memoir, I would
Hold it
definitely
up
do that.
again. It's called Redline. Oops, I can't see where it
There
goes.
you go. Perfect.
Okay. So,
All right.
well, yeah, and feel free to contact me at lindagartz@lindagartz.com if you have any questions. And I have a website, lindagartz.com. There's questions for book groups on the website. There's
Oh, great.
resources, tons of information about redlining if you go to the resources page. Lots of information about my family, which is part of the book, lots of photos. So if you go to lindagartz.com, there's just ton. Oh, and I also have to say it's an audiobook now.
Oh,
So if
good.
you are a listener, you can also listen to this book, I've got two great narrators. It'll be a joy to listen to as well.
Oh, great. I'll have to check that out because I like to listen. And it's been so long since I've read your book that I'm ready to have a listen. So,
Great. I
all
would love
right. Well, thank you, Linda. So nice to talk
it.
to you. Have a
Yes,
great weekend.
likewise.
I'll see you
Thanks, you
soon.
too. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye.